Some time ago, a YouTuber called Joey Bizinger, for many more well known as the Anime Man, made a video called Western Comics Admit Defeat Against Manga. Now, this is obviously a little bit over the top. I mean, most of you know how YouTube works nowadays, but I still thought it was quite interesting. Those of you who've seen Joey's content know that he's generally a very reflected person, and he usually stays as fair as possible when talking about the things he talks about and tries to take as many sides into account as possible. So if you were hoping to get a video of me roasting Joey or his view on that topic, then I don't know, sorry. But I do want to talk about a few things he brought up, since I think it comes at an interesting time and fits quite well into a bigger trend happening, maybe not just in manga, anime, but in gaming and media culture in general. And maybe I can give you, or even Joey, if for some weird reason he would watch this video, a bit of an additional insight or another perspective. Or maybe not, who knows, I still want to talk about it a little bit. In his video, Joey reacts to an article reporting that Jim Lee, president of DC Comics, admitted that manga has advantages over Western comics, which is apparently primarily about sales as far as I understand it, with Jim stating that the manga industry straight out outsells anything the Western comic publishers bring to the table, and so generally also enjoys a wider popularity. Now, just to make it clear, I think we are talking specifically about comics and manga, which, for those who don't know, are basically the Eastern or primarily Japanese equivalent to comic books here, and not the corresponding movies, TV shows, anime series, whatever. I guess if you would include the whole Marvel Cinematic Universe with Disney's marketing budget and the whole situation around that, the situation would maybe be different. At least it would be more complex, because I do not know how much of the interest in those films is actually genuine, or how many people watch it because it's still kind of entertaining and it's the first thing the media marketing machine throws at your face. Anyway, comic publishers seem to think they have a lot to learn from manga. And Joey has made a few observations on why that might be, according to his experience as someone who spends a significant amount of time reading, analyzing, and, well, talking to the internet about manga. I think I started reading manga when I was maybe 12 or 13. I mean, we had Pokemon and Sailor Moon on TV before, but when I was at what for you Americans would be middle school, Carson Comics started selling Dragon Ball books at our local bookstores. Soon after that, you could find Banzai at the kiosk, which was kind of a German attempt to make a Shonen Jump magazine. And I think I've been reading manga ever since, way more than watching anime, to be honest, because it's just faster. And I do realize that from that point on, I did definitely prefer manga over Western comics, although I didn't stop completely. So I think I can kind of relate to the way Joey sees things, but still I think I have one or two things to add. Joey kind of starts with the idea that manga and comics are different worlds that cater to different people. And while I get the idea, I am not 100% sure that this is actually the case. As he says later himself, there are many themes, topics, and stories that you can find in both the world of manga as well as the world of Western comics. Not just the superhero-like narratives that found their way to Japan with Dragon Balls and all of that stuff, but also the other way around. Especially if you go a bit off the main road and look for other examples than your classical Spider-Man or Batman stories. There are a variety of wholesome, deeply personal and philosophical stories out. Just thinking about Mouse or Persepolis from the top of my head. But even in the big series, I would argue that compared to movies, TV shows, and so on, the comic book versions of all those characters and stories are often the deepest and most thoughtful versions. Even some of the examples Joey talks about are technically all based on comic book stories. The Dark Knight takes a lot of material, not all of it, but a lot, from Alan Moore's The Killing Joke. Frank Miller's Sin City is similar to Alan Moore's Watchmen, a very close adaptation of the comic books, or graphic novels, as they prefer their work to be called. Even The Boys is not a story that Netflix just came up with. There is a comic for that. So while I still agree that there is definitely a difference between West and East, I do not necessarily think that they are that different when it comes to the stories themselves or the content itself. But there is a big difference in reception and, let's say, status of comics in their respective area of origin. And I believe a big reason for that although probably not the only one, might be their historical development, which is also a point that Joey touches on that I want to explore a little bit more. When we look at Western comics as a medium, we usually start with short and often humorous strips that you find in newspapers in the late 1800s or early 1900s. You could argue that both Japan and the Eurocentric world at the time, they both had earlier traditions of visual storytelling, but I think most people agree that that is when you start talking about comics. Newspaper comics existed in Japan since the Meiji era. They were imported to the country like a ton of different European stuff at that time. And as far as I can tell, they were like almost the same. They were for entertainment, for satire, and usually not that high art. But one man you have definitely heard of started to have an almost unmatched influence. I'm talking about Walt Disney. Disney was primarily focused on animation and film, but he quickly started to see his characters, Mickey Mouse, Donald Duck, as transmedial. And comics were like the preferred static art form to present their stories. And yeah, Disney started to quickly dominate the comic market. And from what we know, Disney probably shaped two very important ideas. One, comics are for kids. Children were quite obviously Walt Disney's primary audience. Most of the stuff that he made was, by his own definition, made for kids. And two, the characters belonged to the company and not to the artist. While for Disney it was very clear that Donald Duck, Mickey Mouse were his characters, his IP or intellectual property, he was not necessarily the one who drew the comics or the animations for that. It was actually much more common for him to hire other artists. One person we know of who was very fond of old Walt was a Japanese artist many of you might have heard of as well. His name was Osamu Tezuka. I am very bad at pronunciation, so sorry if I butchered that. Who is widely regarded as the father of anime and manga. He was primarily active after World War II in a Japan that was rebuilding itself after a horrid war. And he quite often states Walt Disney as one of his biggest influences. But there was one thing that Tezuka did differently. And I think this is one of the things that started to make the styles, manga, comics, a bit different. He drew most of the stuff himself. I mean, he had assistants, obviously, like he was not doing all the work himself. I think that is still like a common thing to do in Japanese manga, that like you have the main mangaka and you have like his assistants. But yeah, Tezuka saw himself as the primary artist. And from my understanding at least, took a lot of pride in the fact that he was actively working on the product. While Disney had a bit more of a capitalist view, he owned and others worked. The superheroes, as far as I can tell, became really popular in the 20s and 30s. Probably because of the wars, but they were similar to Disney characters in the way that they were owned by the companies, Marvel, DC, and so on, who hired different artists and different writers to work on the stories for those characters, which obviously often ended in very episodic content, which means the writers had to get back to the status quo at the end of their stories so that the next writers would know where to start. I think this is Joey's point on stories not getting an end and stories being rebooted over and over again. There simply was no overarching narrative that has been developed to begin with. Just backstories and world building, kind of what Genshin Impact and all those gachas are doing nowadays. I guess this is the point where Eastern philosophy and especially Eastern work mentality comes into play, because I think that is kind of where the paths split. Because while Japanese companies were definitely also thinking about profit, I do believe that the role of the artist as the central figure was much more pronounced in Japanese culture than it was in the West. Remember, even in film, early Hollywood was dominated by the producers. Auteur directors came later. However, even though Tezuka had a different attitude towards art than maybe Disney had, there were similar movements, similar people in the West. The closest pendant to Tezuka was probably Will Eisner. Both were working heavily with cinematic panel layouts, experimental composition, deep urban themes, emotional storytelling. The similarities are actually quite a lot. Also in the 50s and 60s, people like Stan Lee and Jack Kirby started appearing, who also treated their comics more like soap operas. And at that point, we did actually get more and more serial content. Characters became more flawed and more complex. But also in the 50s, Americans started to get more and more paranoid, were seeing Satanism everywhere, and became worried about what kind of morals comics teach to their children. Censorship became heavy, and I mean like very heavy, while a lot of series just got cancelled. Superheroes got off lightly, I guess, probably because the stories were kind of patriotic. But still, comic book writers in especially America, which was the biggest market at the time, had to follow a lot of rules if they wanted to see their work come even close to a printing press, which I think was an obstacle that Tezuka and his contemporaries did not have to face, at least not to the same extent. That is what I would say is the biggest distinction between comics and manga. In Japan, while publishers do exist, creative control is often centered around a single person, which has its pros and cons, but it makes having a clear narrative easier. And it makes stories feel more personal because they just are. And I do think that at the end of the day, this is something that does resonate with an audience. This is, however, something that you also find in Western comics. When I was a kid in the 90s, Alan Moore, Frank Miller, and Grant Morrison were already household names. Frank Miller's work on Ronin, for example, is even heavily influenced by Japanese manga artists of the time, just to close off the circle a little bit. But I do think that manga had a lot more time to develop a culture that saw and also respected the work as art, while the Western artists often had a harder time, a harder battle with capitalism and ideology that, I don't know, probably even lasts until today. So, Mr. Jim Lee, if you want my opinion on what you can learn from the East, I guess it is look after your artists, respect them. You have great artists. They just need an environment that they can grow in. I mean, yeah, there's a lot to work on if you look at the US currently. But hey, just another good reason to start, I guess. Peace. That's it for me. Thanks for listening to my train of thoughts. I'm always happy if you leave a like, subscribe, comment under the video. I do read my comments, maybe not as fast as I should sometimes, but I do read them. You can also go to my main channel where I usually do not rant as much, but publish my bit more properly and more well-produced video essays. Otherwise, yeah, I hope you have a good day and see you next time. Bye bye.